Hello, everybody. My name is Saad Najmi. I'm a software engineer at Microsoft. I've been there for about 5 years. I started off as a native Apple developer, since I'm in the Microsoft Office on Mac and iOS team. And over time, my role has kind of grown, and we started doing a lot of React Native stuff. The open source projects that me and my team are involved with are React Native macOS, Fluent UI React Native, which is our open source cross-platform UI library, and Fluent UI Apple, which is another open source UI library, mostly for native Apple. For the purpose of this talk, I'll be talking about the first one, React Native macOS. So in this talk, I'm hoping that I can answer a few questions and then show you a few things and just show you the basics of how you can get started with React Native macOS. We'll first talk about what it is and how why Microsoft decided to invest in React Native desktop overall. That includes both macOS and Windows. Where it's used out in the wild and in the App Store. What's new? What are the things that my team has been cooking up down in Seattle? And I'd also like to talk about how you can use it. What are some of the APIs that are available that are common with React Native and also desktop specific? And I'd like to really quickly talk about some of the nitty-gritty implementation details of how we brought React Native to macOS, along with some useful tools in case you do decide to add macOS to your library and want to have a better maintenance story. So let's get started. What is React Native macOS? So to put it simply, we're an out-of-tree platform. And what that means is we're a fork of React Native core. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to refer to upstream React Native as React Native core, just because there's so many forks to keep track of, and that's the easiest way for me to keep it all straight. So we're a fork of React Native, and we have implemented our UI library views stuff on top of AppKit. AppKit is the macOS equivalent of UIKit, in case you're familiar with that from the iOS land. And I do want to be clear, this is not web views, this is not Skia, this is truly built on the native UI platform of macOS. So the next question you might have is, why React Native macOS? Why does Microsoft care about React Native on macOS? And why am I talking to you about it right now? So let's start with, why does Microsoft invest in React Native on desktop overall? If you look at the types of apps we have, say Microsoft Office, we have lots of large apps on many platforms. Office runs on Android, iOS, macOS, and Windows, and web. So that's basically everywhere you can think of running a large app like that. And in addition to that, we have a desire to develop new, modern experiences that are cross-platform, that look and feel great on the platform, and can fit into our large and existing code base, otherwise known as brownfield development. So if you just have those three criteria, that already excludes a lot of other possible technologies. We couldn't do something like Electron, because that's an all or nothing. You can't rewrite an entire app in Electron, or rather, we can't. We can't use something like Mac Catalyst, because that also is all or nothing. And you could use something like WebViews, but you don't get that true native platform integration that you do with something like React Native. So when you have these three considerations in mind, React Native feels like a natural fit. All right, so the next question you might have is, why should you use or care about React Native macOS? And I'm not going to assert that it's the best solution always. I think it is a solution that may work well for your use case. The first obvious place is you have better platform integration. You can go down into native code. You can use the windowing API of desktop. You can use the native look and feel of the native AppKit controls. So that's one obvious win. The second is, if you're a React Native or iOS developer, I think you'll find that React Native macOS is a very familiar and natural transition. A lot of the UIKit and AppKit classes are the same, and a lot of the React Native JavaScript API is shared. And lastly, even if you never use React Native macOS, I truly do think that React Native on more platforms means a better React Native for everyone. As I mentioned, Microsoft invests heavily in React Native, and that means we do a lot of upstream contributions back to React Native core whenever we need to, say, refactor something to be a little more cross-platform. And that makes its way to everyone else and leads to a better community. So Next, I'd like to show you a few apps where React Native macOS is used. So I've already talked about Microsoft Office. We've had lots of conference talks in the past where we've showed off a lot of cross-platform React Native experiences in Office. So I won't talk about this one too much. The second one is Messenger Desktop. Messenger Desktop actually recently switched from Electron to React Native for their macOS and Windows app. And as far as I can tell, they have never looked back. I was listening to a talk they gave 2 years ago at React Conf, where they said they had like an 80% reduction in binary size and like a 60% reduction in cold start performance, like truly massive improvements in numbers. So those are two big companies using React Native. I'd like to also talk about some smaller apps. The next two apps are actually made by the same guy. His name is Oscar Franco. He's been kind of tinkering with React Native macOS for a while, and I think he has some interesting use cases. So the first is CI daemon. This is a simple menu bar app that just shows you the state of your CI builds in GitHub and other places. And it's like, I just like it because it looks good, but it also kind of shows you how you can use React Native in new contexts and places that you wouldn't have otherwise thought you could stick React Native. And lastly, this is actually one of my new favorite apps, is Sol. Sol is a Spotlight replacement. It's all built in React Native. It's a floating, borderless window. And this is the type of thing that I would have never thought to build with React Native macOS. So it really goes to show that creativity knows no limits. All right. So those are some places where it's used. Let's talk about what's new. So first off, we released React Native macOS 0.71. Thank you. So this is the first version that's caught up with React Native Core. And by that, I mean you can use the same version of React Native, the latest version, on all the platforms for your app. If you've been following us for a bit, you might have seen that we're usually behind a few versions. And we've been doing a lot of work to catch up and sync literally thousands of commits so that we can be caught up and stay caught up in the future. And additionally, being on the latest release helps us use the latest new features from React Native, like Fabric. So I'm really, really happy to say that we've been working closely with the Messenger Desktop team, and they've helped us to implement an experimental version of Fabric on React Native macOS. This uses the same setup as iOS, which is you pass in RCT new arc enabled equals 1 pod install whenever you're doing your pod install, and then you get a macOS app running on Fabric. Yeah, so let's go to a demo. So I'm actually curious about this. How many of you guys have seen RN Tester in the past? OK, that's like maybe like 10% of the audience. OK, so if you haven't seen RN Tester, you definitely should. What RN Tester basically is the example app for the React Native repo. It has a showcase of every API that React Native Core has. And because React Native macOS and Windows are forks, we have an implementation of RN Tester on our repo. So I love this because it's basically living documentation for what works in React Native macOS and what doesn't. So if we look at something simple like View, you can see we have background color and border, things you would expect. But we also have some interesting things, like Cursor, which lets you change the type of cursor that you have on your view. You also have APIs. So we've got platform color. That's one thing that we do support. Actually, I think the original platform color implementation was proposed by a React Native macOS maintainer back in the day. So that's one way that we have contributed things upstream. And we also have other stuff like app state. So if you're ever curious about like what works and what doesn't, you can always just use RN Tester and find out. So I did mention that we have Fabric. So if I scroll one more to the left, you can see RN Tester in Fabric. Could you tell the difference? No? That's a good thing. That means it's working. So like, when I say this is active development, I really do mean it. We merged like 4 or 5 pull requests just this week that made this demo a lot better. You know, like this is really, really, really a good demo, and I'm really happy about it. Yeah, I'm sorry. Fabric makes me happy, and then I forget how to say words. I'd like to show off one more thing. We do have some native components that you can see, like Switch. Fun fact about Switch. Before macOS 10.15, Mac didn't actually have a native Switch component. So in React Native macOS, we just put a checkbox in here. So yay, progress. All right, back to the talk. Let's talk about using React Native macOS. So some of our guiding principles when we're developing React Native macOS is we want to be as similar to iOS as possible. And that is because we share a lot of code with iOS, and the two native platforms are quite similar in code too. And what I want you to take away from that is if you're developing a React Native app and something works in iOS and you're wondering, does it work in macOS? It probably does. And if you're not sure, you can always go and check rn tester. So in addition to a bunch of the React Native mobile APIs, we do have some desktop-specific APIs. Because as we know, computers have mouses and keyboards and other stuff that phones don't. So let's walk through some of those. The first is we have some support for mouse handling. On top of view, we have on-mouse enter, on-mouse leave. You can use those callbacks to, say, style a hover effect. You should be familiar with this from web. And in Pressable, those are mapped to the more cross-platform friendly names of on-hover in and on-hover out. On the keyboard side, we have support for keyboard focus. So we've exposed the focus and blur properties so that you know when a view has been tabbed into, basically. The focusable prop was actually an Android prop that on desktop we ported to work for macOS and Windows. And lastly, we also have a desktop-specific prop called enable focus ring. And what that basically says is either you can enable it to get the system focus ring, or you can disable it to put your own custom styling. Lastly, we have our keyboard event API. This is the most complex of the three that I'm showing. But this lets you listen to what keys you're pressing on a view while it has keyboard focus. We have the on key down and on key up that you should be familiar with from web. And we also have these additional props called valid keys down and valid keys up. These are macOS specific. We need them because of the way that events travel both the native and JavaScript view hierarchy. And we basically need this to keep the two events in sync. It's effectively just an array of the keys you're listening to that you want on key down and on key up to fire for. Windows has a similar set of properties called key down events and key up events. All right, so I've shown you how you can use React Native. Now let's talk about getting started with React Native. What if you want to create a new template project? So the natural starting place would be our React Native macOS init command. And what this is you can initialize a normal React Native project using React Native init and pass it your version and all that stuff. And then you can run our React Native macOS init. This will add React Native macOS as a dependency, and it will copy and generate the extra target in your Xcode project for macOS and add some extra native files. It'll basically get you started with all the native boilerplate code that you need. And at this point, if you're feeling fancy, you can also run React Native Windows init. It's almost like those two commands are meant to be used with each other. Yeah, and that will get you the boilerplate code for a Windows project. We have the instructions for how to run this on aka.ms/React Native. So at this point, I'm going to do a second demo. So I've got our template project over here. It's just going to show the hello world screen. And you can see that we have our macOS app delegates and view controller. The view controller is what's creating our root view. So if I go and close the Metro server from the other demo and start the one over here, and run this one. Oh, nope, that's not what I want. You have React Native macOS. So I want to take this one step further. And I want to see if I can make a menu bar app. I showed you a few of those earlier. I saw on Reddit that literally one other one came out like this week. Again, a lot of stuff just happened this week. So what I did is I basically just Googled, how do I make a menu bar app? Found a bunch of links. And let's start modifying this project. So the first thing we need to do is in our app delegate, we need to create a status item. This is the object that represents one of these menu bar icons. And by the way, I'm doing this demo in Objective-C, but you could easily do this in Swift. I'm just choosing Objective-C because it's what the template's in. So next, we need to go and initialize that status item. Let's uncomment this. And we need to set its image and its click handler. For the image, we can use our favorite app, Sol, to find the Apple System Images app. This is called SF Symbols, and choose what we want it to look like. I found this one called Atom, which I think should work well for our use cases. And then we have to implement the show popover function. So this, if we uncomment this, will create an NS popover. You'll see what that is soon enough. And we'll also add the view controller for the React Native view and show the popover relative to the button. And lastly, because AppKit can be annoying, we do have to override load view, which is going to create the parent view of the root view. And I'm just choosing a hard-coded size for this demo. So if I run this now, wait, nope, I need to build it. All right, so we have our normal window. But if I minimize this, we now have React Native in a menu bar. Thank you. However, I am not done. So I have a secret reason for doing this in a menu bar. So back in my days as a native Apple developer, when I was working on Fluent UI Apple on the macOS side, me and two of my coworkers, Mark and Lucas, mostly Lucas, built this native date picker for macOS. This is because we were not happy with the system date picker, and we wanted to have something better that we could use in open source and in Office. And then later on, my friend Mark, he created this menu bar app. And I think it's a pretty great app. It's pretty simple. You ever need to look at a calendar, you got access to it. But I've always thought, can it be done in React Native? So what I really want to do is I want to create a menu bar app, or a calendar. So what I can do is change the name of that symbol and run this. So now we have a calendar. But that's not really a calendar. OK, so is there maybe like a React Native calendar project we can use? So back to our good friend Google. Turns out there is. Wix has a project called React Native Calendars. It's purely JS, but it says it only works for Android and iOS. We'll see about that. So what I love about this is that they literally have just sample code that you can copy and paste to run. So let's do that. In my App.js, so I just copied that to a new file called calendar app. No changes, like straight copy and paste. And in the index.js, I'm just going to, let's do this, uncomment this and comment this out. And if I save, we now have a calendar. Yeah, so take that, Mark. I made your app in 5 minutes. All right, that's enough for the live demos. So that's all great and dandy. That's how you get to a simple starter app. But let's say we don't want to deal with the native boilerplate code of yet another platform. Maybe you're a library maintainer, and upgrades already scare you enough, and you really just want to focus on the JS and not worry about native code. And for that, I recommend React Native Test App. This is another repo that Microsoft maintains. It's basically an NPM package that does its best to handle all the native bits for you, but also be like a simple React Native app. It supports Android, iOS, macOS, and Windows, all the ones that we use. And it will take the macOS template code and boil it down to a single pod file. And that pod file will have 3 lines of code. I really love this because it's so simple and so easy, and it's backwards compatible with old versions of React Native, and it supports Fabric in the new architecture. The setup for this is pretty simple. You just add it as a developer dependency, and then you run their command init test app. So yeah, that's a bit of using React Native macOS and creating fun apps. Let's talk about some of the nitty-gritty details. I won't go into this too much because I could spend all day talking about it, but we'll just go over the basics. So I mentioned earlier that we're a fork of React Native iOS code. And by that, I mean we have lots and lots of if-defs. If you take a look at this example over here, this is a method that is in React Native Core that tells you if your app is foreground or background. In React Native core, which is just like upstream React Native, you'd only have this one line. But in our repo, where we forked it, we've added this if-def to do the iOS implementation if we're not iOS, and then the macOS implementation if there is one. So, and then we also add these diff tags to help us keep track of where we've added code. So we've done this for literally everywhere there is native iOS code. And that is quite a lot. We like this because this helps make sure that we are correct, especially as we're upgrading between versions of React Native, because as the native iOS code changes, we also have to update our diffs for macOS. We don't always use if-defs. Sometimes we'll have a type def for the app-kit to UI-kit name if the two classes are similar enough. And sometimes we'll have a subclass where it's a wrapper class over, let's say, UI view. And on iOS, it'll be UI view, and on macOS, it'll be NS view with a bunch of extra methods to make it more similar to iOS. It really is context dependent, and this shim layer, we call it RCT UI kit. The reason that this is important is because we could reuse this shim layer for Fabric, and that is why we're able to get Fabric up and running pretty quickly. And as we continue implementing Fabric, we can continue improving the shim layer, which in turn also improves the paper implementation. It's all shared code goodness. All right, so one quick note about releases. We tend to release a new patch release for every commit. The reason for that is because the code you see on GitHub is the code that we use internally. So if I just released 71 and I found a bug and I want to fix it, I want to use that as fast as possible. Therefore, new patch release. And what that also means is that as we release a new version, we tend to have a lot of fast iteration until we towards a stable release. So it might be more common to see version numbers like 0.68.30 instead of 0.68.6. All right, so the last part of my talk will be a few useful tools if you do decide to add or try out macOS in one of your libraries. So I've already mentioned React Native Test App. That's super useful. There's also the upgrade helper. I think a lot of you know about that. If you didn't know, it does support React Native macOS via its dropdown. And we'll show you how to diff the template projects there. The last one, we've also talked about this in a different talk, so I'll cover it really quickly, is align deps. This is basically a one-line magic command that will update all of your package dependencies across your entire monorepo with the correct version that supports whatever platforms for React Native you have. So when you have, say, macOS and Windows in a project and you don't know which version of React Native SVG works, you can use this command and it'll know which one is the right one and update it everywhere. All right. That's the end of my talk. I have a few links over here. You can find our Getting Started guide at aka.us/reactnative. You can follow us on Twitter. Here are some of the talks I've mentioned. And stay tuned for Chain React, where some of my coworkers at the React Native Windows team will talk about their experience maintaining that repo. And also, there will be a talk about Messenger desktop switching from Electron to React Native. Thank you.